Deep in Florida's swamps, cameras are capturing an aftermath that's leaving scientists completely baffled. For decades, we've only heard about the invasion, the total takeover by massive pythons. But recent footage is showing something entirely new. It reveals a hidden consequence that nobody saw coming, and a desperate gamble that the entire world laughed at. The pythons are still there, but they are no longer the only story. What's been discovered in the Everglades isn't just an apocalypse. It's a shocking, unexpected twist that changes everything we thought we understood about this broken paradise. Long before the chaos began, the Florida Everglades was a living, breathing miracle. It wasn't simply a swamp. It was a vast, slow-moving river of grass stretching across more than 1.5 million acres. This was an ancient, intricate system, a subtropical wilderness that pulsed with life. It was so valuable that its worth was estimated at over $31.5 billion every single year. It wasn't just home to alligators and birds. It provided flood protection and clean drinking water for millions of people across South Florida. Life here moved in a perfect, delicate balance. Enormous flocks of wading birds, herons, egrets, and ibis would blanket the sky, so many that they resembled moving clouds. Raccoons, opossums, and marsh rabbits darted through the sawgrass, while bobcats and native foxes stalked the edges of the tree islands known as hammocks. It was one of the last truly wild places left on Earth, and nobody, not even the experts, imagined it could come apart so quickly. This entire nightmare didn't begin with a bang. It started with a whisper and a storm. In August of 1992, Hurricane Andrew, a devastating Category 5 storm, tore through southern Florida. Winds were howling at over 165 miles per hour. It leveled entire neighborhoods, and in the chaos, it tore apart a reptile breeding facility near Miami. When the winds finally calmed, an unknown number of Burmese pythons, a species originally from Southeast Asia, had slipped away into the wetlands. But that storm wasn't the only problem. At the exact same time, a slower disaster was quietly unfolding. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, Burmese pythons were the hottest new exotic pet around. People bought them as tiny $10 snakes, thinking they were fascinating. But those cool snakes don't stay small. They grow, and they grow fast. A snake that fits in your palm becomes a 10-foot, 50-pound monster in just a few years. And they don't stop there. They can exceed 20 feet in length and weigh over 200 pounds, heavy enough to bring down a full-grown deer. Overwhelmed pet owners, now stuck with a giant, dangerous predator, did the only thing they could think of. They drove to the edge of the Everglades and simply let them go. They thought they were setting them free. Instead, they were lighting the fuse on an ecological time bomb. Now that's the version of the story everyone has been told. But here's a wilder thought. What if the pet owner story is just the convenient excuse? What if the hurricane didn't just damage a facility, but the facility? A massive, undocumented breeding operation that flooded the swamp with thousands of snakes all at once? Some researchers have quietly suggested that the sheer speed of the invasion doesn't line up with just a handful of scattered pet releases. It's a mystery that has never been solved. For years, nobody paid much attention. A few sightings here and there were treated as curiosities, but the pythons weren't just surviving out there. They were thriving. The Everglades turned out to be a perfect storm of opportunity for them. An absolute paradise. The heat, the humidity, the endless shallow water, and a massive all-you-can-eat buffet of native animals. Animals that had absolutely zero natural defenses. They had never, in their entire evolutionary history, encountered a predator anything like this. The Burmese python is a marvel of biological engineering. They are masters of camouflage, vanishing completely into the grass. They can hold their breath underwater for over 30 minutes. And the most remarkable part, they have heat-sensing pits along their jaws that allow them to detect the body heat of a warm-blooded animal in total darkness. A raccoon doesn't stand a chance. And then there's the reproduction. A single female can lay a clutch of up to 100 eggs. With no natural predators keeping them in check, their numbers went through the roof. Today, experts estimate there are anywhere from 100,000 to over 300,000 pythons moving through South Florida. And the paradise that once overflowed with life is now growing silent. The numbers are so grim they seem impossible. A landmark study from 2012 exposed the horrifying truth. In the hardest-hit areas of the Everglades, raccoon populations had collapsed by 99.3%. Opossums were down 98.9%, and bobcats had declined by 87.5%. Not 10%, not 50%, but 99%, simply erased. What most people don't fully grasp is what this actually feels like on the ground. Biologists and hunters who have spent decades working in the Everglades describe the silence. They remember driving down the loop roads and having to stop for raccoons and turtles crossing the path. Now they can go miles, even days, without seeing anything. The small mammals that formed the entire foundation of the food web had been systematically consumed. The invaders had found heaven, and they were devouring it whole. The balance that had held the Everglades together for thousands of years wasn't just damaged, it was shattered. And as officials finally woke up to the scale of the crisis, they realized they were chasing a ghost. The swamp had gone silent, but the pythons hadn't come alone. As the silence in the Everglades grew impossible to ignore, the state of Florida finally had to act. But their early response looked like something straight out of a low-budget reality television show. In 2013, officials launched the Florida Python Challenge. It was equal parts publicity stunt and desperate lottery ticket. They invited the general public, basically anyone brave or adventurous enough to wade into the swamp and hunt the giant invaders. They offered cash prizes, including a $10,000 grand prize for whoever removed the most snakes. It became an annual spectacle. By 2024, over 800 people from across the country and even from Canada showed up, armed with traps, snake hooks, and nerves of steel, ready to accomplish what decades of policy had failed to do. That year, they captured 195 Burmese pythons. The headlines were impressive. The photographs were dramatic. It felt like progress. But let's do the math. They removed 195 snakes. A year later, in 2025, they broke a new record with 294 snakes removed. This sounds significant, right? Well, consider this. Taking the most conservative estimate of 100,000 pythons in the wild, removing 294 of them amounts to less than 0.3% of the population. If the real number is closer to 300,000, the impact is statistically zero. It's like trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon while the tide keeps rushing in. The Everglades wasn't recovering. It was just serving as a backdrop for a hunting competition. And the pythons were outbreeding the effort entirely. So the state got more serious. They brought in professionals. The South Florida Water Management District hired 24 elite paid hunters. These weren't weekend thrill seekers. These were career python trackers, paid an hourly wage to work the levees and swamps day and night, every single day of the year. Since 2017, these contractors have removed thousands of pythons. Combined with all other efforts, state, federal, and private, over 23,000 pythons have been pulled from the wild. That number is genuinely impressive. But even that massive achievement, the result of years of dedicated, relentless work, likely represents less than 5% of the total population. For every single snake they find, 20 more are hatching out of sight, hidden deep in the endless sawgrass. Frustrated, Florida turned to high-tech approaches. If they couldn't locate them on the ground, they'd spot them from the air. They deployed drones equipped with high-resolution thermal cameras, expecting to pick up the snake's heat signatures from above. But there was a fundamental problem. The Everglades is hot, the ground is hot, the water is hot, and pythons are cold-blooded, meaning they are extraordinarily good at adjusting their body temperature to match their environment. To a thermal camera, a resting python looks no different from a warm rock or a patch of mud. The dense canopy of trees and mangroves makes spotting anything below nearly impossible. The drones failed. Then came the robot rabbits. Engineers built artificial rabbits that produced heat and made sounds, designed to lure pythons into a trap. That failed too. Pythons are ambush predators. They wait, perfectly motionless, for real prey to cross their path. They had no interest in clunky, noisy machines. The most promising sounding approach involved using what are called scout snakes, or Judas snakes. The concept was clever. Researchers would capture a large male python, surgically implant a small radio transmitter, and release it back into the wild during mating season. Driven by instinct, the male would theoretically lead researchers straight to a large, egg-filled female. This program has produced real results. It has led to the removal of some of the biggest, most reproductively active females ever found. But it is painfully slow, extraordinarily expensive, and amounts to winning inches in a war that demands miles. And here's the wildest idea of all. What if the snakes are simply too intelligent? The hunters and biologists working out there every single day talk about it openly. They say it's uncanny. The snakes appear to know where the traps have been set. They avoid the levees where hunters regularly patrol. The Judas snakes sometimes lead researchers on bizarre circular pursuits lasting months, almost as though they sense they're being followed. Is it possible that an apex predator, once introduced into a new environment free of any real threat, begins to develop a new level of cunning? It's an unsettling possibility. The technology was falling short. The hunters were being outmaneuvered. The frustration was palpable. Years of effort, enormous sums of money, and a long list of failed experiments all pointed toward the same uncomfortable conclusion. The pythons had won. Scientists began saying so publicly. Complete eradication was impossible. The best that could realistically be hoped for was management and containment. These predators had claimed the Everglades as their territory, and no amount of human ingenuity seemed capable of taking it back. But the real enemy wasn't the one they could actually see. This is where the story takes a dark and completely unexpected turn. What if Florida's most serious problem wasn't the 20-foot python everyone was hunting, but something microscopic that nobody even knew was present? Deep in the Everglades, a silent passenger had arrived alongside the invaders. It was an unseen parasite, an unwanted gift from the pythons, and it is now rewriting Florida's ecological story in the most disturbing way imaginable. Its name is Rhabdius orientalis. It's more commonly known as the snake lungworm. Scientists first stumbled upon this threat while performing necropsies on native Florida snakes. They were finding native species, garter snakes, pygmy rattlesnakes, water snakes, that were severely underweight, weak, and struggling to breathe. When they opened them up, they discovered something horrifying. Their lungs and airways were packed with dozens, sometimes hundreds of tiny, writhing worms. They traced the source quickly. This lungworm originates from Asia, the native homeland of the Burmese python. Over thousands of years, pythons and this parasite developed alongside each other. The pythons can carry the lungworm without suffering serious consequences. They have built-in defenses. But Florida's native snakes have absolutely no natural defense whatsoever. This parasite is a brand new, entirely alien threat to them. The way this new plague spreads is terrifyingly straightforward. An infected python defecates in the swamp. Those droppings contain the lungworm's eggs. Cockroaches and other insects feed on the waste, and the eggs hatch inside them. Lizards and frogs then eat those infected insects. Finally, a native Florida snake consumes that infected frog or lizard. Once inside the snake's body, the larvae begin their journey. They don't remain in the stomach. They bore through the stomach wall and travel directly into the lungs. There they grow, feeding on blood and tissue, and they reproduce. They clog the snake's airways until breathing becomes impossible. For many native snakes, this infection is a brutal, drawn-out end. They become too weak to hunt. They slowly starve while simultaneously suffocating. Researchers have found native snakes with severe pneumonia and open bleeding lesions throughout their lungs. In the most devastating cases, they discovered snakes with dozens of these worms literally crawling out of their mouths as they took their final breaths. This is the true unexpected aftermath. The pythons were the first wave. They eliminated the mammals. This parasite is the second wave, and it's targeting the native reptiles. The real shock came when scientists discovered just how extensively the lungworm had already spread. It's no longer confined to the Everglades. At least 18 different native snake species across Florida have already been found to be infected. The parasite's reach now extends through dozens of counties. Some reports place it as far north as Jacksonville, with signs it's continuing to push toward the Panhandle. And here's the part that genuinely terrifies scientists. The pythons may have introduced it, but the lungworm no longer needs them. It has successfully established itself in native hosts, and is now spreading entirely on its own, passing from native snake to native snake. So even if, by some miracle, every single Burmese python was removed from Florida tomorrow, the lungworm would still be here. It is embedded. It is alive. It is thriving. When native snakes, a critical component of the food web, begin to vanish, the entire balance collapses again. Rodents and other pests multiply unchecked. Larger predators that rely on snakes as prey, birds of prey like hawks and eagles, lose a key food source. Now for the wild theories. Is this parasite mutating? It already made the leap from an Asian host to dozens of North American hosts. What's stopping it from jumping again? This raises the most alarming question of all. Could it eventually infect mammals or even humans? Researchers say this is highly unlikely. But here's the uncomfortable reality. They didn't think it could jump from pythons to native garter snakes either, and it did. What happens if a stray dog eats an infected frog? What happens to a hunter who handles an infected snake without protection? Right now, the consensus is that we're safe. But in a situation where this organism is constantly adapting, the word safe carries a lot of weight. There is, however, one strange and intriguing twist. The Florida cottonmouth, a native pit viper, appears to show a strong resistance to this parasite. Nobody knows why. Could it be something in its genetics, its diet, or its biology? This has generated its own theory. What if the cottonmouth holds the key? What if something in its blood contains the secret to an anti-parasitic treatment, perhaps even a cure? What began as a battle against a giant visible monster has evolved into a war against an invisible microscopic one. There is no cure. There is no treatment. And there is no clear way to stop it. A threat nobody could see was quietly finishing off the survivors. Florida was running out of options, so they turned to a plan so outrageous that the entire world laughed out loud. With the python invasion completely beyond control and a new invisible parasite spreading like wildfire, Florida had reached a point of desperation. The state had become a global punchline. The ecosystem was barely on life support, and that's when officials made their announcement. When the news broke, it sounded like a joke, something ripped straight from a late-night comedy sketch or a tabloid headline. Florida officials were releasing hundreds of additional snakes into the wild to help combat the invasive python crisis. The reaction was immediate and merciless. Social media erupted. Doesn't Florida have enough snakes already? Fighting snakes with more snakes? What could possibly go wrong? The comparisons to past ecological disasters came flooding in. People brought up the cane toads, released in Australia in the 1930s to control beetles. The toads ignored the beetles, multiplied into the billions, and became a toxic plague still devastating Australian wildlife nearly a century later. People brought up the mongooses introduced to Hawaii in the 1880s to control rats in the sugarcane fields. The problem was that rats are nocturnal and mongooses are active during the day. They almost never crossed paths. So the mongooses turned their attention elsewhere and ended up devastating Hawaii's native ground-nesting birds. This, people screamed, was exactly the same kind of mistake. Another case of humans playing God and making everything dramatically worse. News outlets ran headlines that sounded like bad science fiction. Worried residents questioned whether their pets and children were safe. To the average person, it felt completely absurd, a plan guaranteed to fail before it even started. But this wasn't a reckless idea. And this wasn't just any snake. Behind all the laughter and the dramatic headlines, scientists had been quietly working for decades on a desperate, carefully considered plan. The snake being released was the eastern indigo snake, and it wasn't an invader at all. It was the rightful ruler of this land, returning to reclaim its place. The eastern indigo snake is known as the Emperor of the Forest, and the title is well earned. It is the longest native snake in all of North America, a powerful, non-venomous predator capable of growing up to 9 feet in length. Its scales are a breathtaking iridescent blue-black that shimmers brilliantly in sunlight, with a striking patch of reddish-orange beneath its chin. But its appearance isn't what makes it remarkable. Its diet is what makes it legendary. The eastern indigo is what's known as ophiophagus, meaning it eats other snakes, and it is completely immune to the venom of North America's pit vipers. Rattlesnakes, cottonmouths, copperheads, the indigo consumes them all. It doesn't constrict its prey. It simply pins them down with powerful jaws and swallows them whole and alive, entirely unfazed by the struggle. It is, without question, the dominant force on the forest floor. Its range once stretched from South Carolina through Georgia and Florida, and west into Mississippi. But that territory collapsed. The indigo snake's decline is linked to two things: longleaf pine forests and gopher tortoises. The snake flourished in the ancient longleaf pine ecosystem, a habitat that once covered nearly 90 million acres across the southeast. Today, due to logging, development, and the suppression of natural fire cycles, almost 97% of that original forest is gone. The indigo also doesn't dig its own shelter. It depends almost entirely on the deep sandy burrows excavated by the gopher tortoise. These burrows function like underground apartment buildings, providing refuge from fire and cold temperatures. More than 350 other species also depend on these same burrows. The gopher tortoise is what ecologists call a keystone species, one that an entire ecosystem is structured around. As the longleaf pines were cleared and tortoises were hunted or pushed out, the indigo snake disappeared along with them. During the Great Depression, people even dug up tortoises for food and killed any snakes they found sheltering inside the burrows. By 1978, the eastern indigo snake had been listed as a threatened species. It had been entirely wiped out from Alabama and from North Florida. So the so-called laughable plan wasn't about introducing something new. It was about restoring a native apex predator that humans themselves had already eliminated. For decades, a dedicated coalition of conservation organizations and state agencies had been painstakingly breeding eastern indigos in captivity. They had been slowly restoring patches of longleaf pine forest and working to protect gopher tortoise populations across the region. What appeared to the public to be an impulsive, absurd idea was in reality one of the most carefully considered, methodically executed, and scientifically supported restoration efforts ever undertaken. But that doesn't make the concerns unreasonable. What if this does turn into a mongoose situation? What if releasing a new apex predator into a system that is already fundamentally broken creates a new problem? What will the indigos eat once they've eaten the pythons, assuming they can even take them on? What if they become the next threat? Scientists insist the research supports the approach. But that's also what they said in Hawaii. The emperor was back. The stage was being set. But the truly shocking part of this aftermath was already unfolding somewhere else. While the world was occupied mocking the snake versus snake plan, something else entirely was happening in the swamp. Something nobody had predicted. Nature, it turned out, was already beginning to adapt on its own. Deep in the Big Cypress National Preserve, researchers were tracking a 13-foot, 52-pound male python they had named Loki. The snake was carrying a GPS tracker as part of a breeding study. One December morning, the team went to check on his location, expecting a routine update. What they found left them completely stunned. Loki's massive body was sprawled out in the grass. His head had been chewed clean off and tucked under a nearby cluster of pine needles. This was a 52-pound apex predator. What in the Everglades could possibly do that? A few days later, a trail camera positioned nearby captured the unbelievable answer. It was a native bobcat, one that biologists estimated weighed barely 25 pounds. This discovery shocked the entire wildlife community. Experts described it as unprecedented. A native bobcat had successfully stalked, killed, and consumed an adult Burmese python more than twice its own body weight. For 2 decades, these pythons had been the unchallenged monsters of the swamp, feared by everything around them. Suddenly, one of Florida's own had flipped the script. Some experts speculated that a recent cold snap had slowed the python's reactions, leaving it vulnerable. But that's where the new theories begin. What if it wasn't a fluke at all? What if native predators are genuinely learning? This wasn't an isolated incident. Across Florida, more evidence began to surface. Alligators, the original apex predators of the swamp, were being observed ambushing and consuming smaller pythons. Even the rare and endangered Florida panther has been documented engaging with these invaders. What if the native predators are somehow communicating, not through language, but through observed behavior? What if one bobcat watched another or learned from a failed attempt and is now passing that knowledge to its young? What if the home team is finally beginning to identify the monster's vulnerabilities? One wildlife biologist famously called it a point for the home team. The Everglades were starting to push back. But this kind of adaptation is painfully gradual. A single bobcat cannot undo 2 decades of devastation. For every python taken down by a native predator, thousands more are hatching, concealed and safe, deep in the sawgrass. And that's exactly what makes the other part of this story so important. For years, conservation teams had been releasing their captive-bred eastern indigo snakes into a protected area in North Florida, the Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines Preserve. This location sits hundreds of miles north of the main python stronghold, but it is the indigo's ancestral home. Researchers tagged the snakes, tracked them carefully, and hoped for the best. Then, in the autumn of 2023, something extraordinary happened. Trail cameras at the preserve recorded footage that changed the entire conversation. The footage showed 2 wild-born hatchlings of the eastern indigo snake. They were the offspring of the previously released adults. For the first time in nearly half a century, the eastern indigo snake had successfully reproduced in the wild in North Florida. This was no longer just survival. This was genuine revival. When biologists confirmed that one of the young snakes carried no tag, it was undeniable proof. That snake had been born entirely outside of human assistance. The indigos weren't simply holding on. They were living, hunting, and raising the next generation in their ancestral habitat. As 2024 and 2025 continued, the story grew even more encouraging. Teams began spotting additional snakes. A healthy 6-foot male was recorded moving confidently through the scrub. 19 other snakes from earlier release years were identified, still alive and doing well. At the heart of this recovery was the land itself. The slow, painstaking work of restoring the longleaf pine ecosystem and protecting gopher-tortoise burrows had finally paid off. The ecosystem wasn't just being repaired. It was beginning to function again on its own terms. Now, to be completely honest about what this means, does this mean the indigo snakes are going to consume all the pythons and solve everything? Absolutely not. The indigos are being reestablished in North Florida. The python stronghold is hundreds of miles to the south in the Everglades. They aren't even in the same territory yet. But that's not the real point. The true unexpected aftermath, the one nobody anticipated, is actually 2 things happening at once. First, nature itself is adapting. Bobcats and alligators are learning. Second, a conservation effort built on patience, genuine scientific understanding, and trust in nature's own balance actually worked. For decades, the story of the Everglades was a story of human failure. Failure to prevent the invasion, failure to reverse it, failure after failure with high-tech approaches that promised everything and delivered almost nothing. But the solution that is finally offering a genuine flicker of hope wasn't a drone or a robot or a piece of surveillance technology. It was a native snake. It was the slow, difficult work of restoring the land and bringing back the animal that belonged there in the first place. The pythons remain a crisis. The lungworm remains a plague spreading quietly through the ecosystem. But footage from Florida's swamps has finally revealed an aftermath that nobody anticipated. Resilience. Hope. But this is where the final question leaves us hanging. What happens next? What happens when the eastern indigo's expanding territory, spreading gradually southward, finally meets the python's territory, which is also expanding northward? And more critically, what happens when the lungworm encounters the emperor? What if this invisible plague, also moving north, begins infecting the newly restored indigo snakes? Are we working to bring back a native species only to hand it over to a microscopic killer? The real aftermath isn't a conclusion. It's the beginning of a new 3-way conflict: the python, the parasite, and the emperor. Are we watching a recovery unfold, or just witnessing the next chapter of the apocalypse? Let us know your theory below, and don't forget to like and subscribe.